Do you remember the game we played when we were kids? Follow the leader? If you don't, it's a pretty simple game. The basic idea behind the game is whatever the leader in the line would do, you did. And so if the leader raised his hand, his right hand, then you would raise your right hand. And if he started marching in place, you were supposed to march in place. And if he, for some reason, put his finger on his nose, you were supposed to put your finger on your nose. I don't know why we played it so much as we were kids. I'm guessing our teachers in school had an idea, had a reason for it. But even as adults, I think we are called to follow the leader. More specifically, I think we're called to follow Christ. And that brings us to Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3 will be our main text this morning. We really won't leave Mark at all because we've been working our way through the Gospel of Mark in a series that we're calling Messiah on a Mission. We're looking at Jesus' life and his ministry there in Mark's Gospel, and we've seen already in this series the very beginning of Jesus' life. We've seen Jesus' authority and how he's working miracles and how he's teaching with authority. We've seen there in Mark chapter 2 and 3 how the Jewish people begin to have questions. And they go to Jesus, and those questions they have for Jesus kind of provoke the people to make a decision. What will they do with Jesus? So far in our study, we've seen a growing popularity of Jesus. But we've also seen growing opposition to Jesus. There in Mark chapter 3 and verse 6, it tells us that the Pharisees, those Jewish leaders, went out and started to plot with the Herodians on how they could kill Jesus. And here in Mark chapter 3, our text from today, from Mark chapter 3, 7 to the end of the chapter, there is this really clear contrast, I think, between the crowds who are following Jesus because of what Jesus can do for them, how Jesus can heal them, how Jesus can cast out their demons, for all these things that Jesus may do for them. And the called, those people who are really following Jesus, who really know what it looks like to follow the leader. And I think a lot of us talk about following Christ. If someone at work or someone at school or someone in our neighborhood comes up and says, "Are you a Christian?" We say, "Yeah, well, I'm a Christian. I follow Christ. I'm a disciple of Christ." A lot of us would say, "Yes, of course." But when the rubber meets the road and we look at our life and we look at our conduct, when we look at our hearts, are we really following the leader? I think Mark chapter 3 has a lot to teach us of what it really, truly means to follow the leader. What it means to live as a disciple of Christ. And I think here in Mark 3 we see three opportunities. Three opportunities that we have if we follow the leader to tell people about Christ. But three opportunities, I think, challenge us to answer the question, are we in the crowd or are we in the called? Are we really following the leader? Let's begin in Mark chapter 3, beginning in verse 13, where it reads, Jesus went up the mountain and summoned, some translations may even say called there, those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, to be with him. That's key. Keep that in mind. To send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. He appointed the 12 to Simon. He gave the name Peter, and to James, the son of Zebedee, and to his brother John, he gave the name Boanerges, which that is, sons of thunder. That's a great name to have. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon, the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. You know, the first opportunity we have if we are following Jesus is that opportunity to be with Jesus. There in Mark chapter 3, verses 7 through 12, which we didn't read, the crowds are coming from all over Palestine, all over the region, and they're coming to Jesus for one simple reason: miracles. They've seen what Jesus has done. They've seen Jesus cast out demons. They've seen Jesus heal the sick, and they're going, "Hey, I've got a demon. I need him to cast out that demon from me. I'm sick, I'm lame, I'm blind, I'm mute. I need Jesus to make me be able to walk. I need Jesus to be able to make me see. I want to be able to hear. And so they're going to Jesus so Jesus will heal them. But in the middle of all this activity, Jesus steps aside there in verse 13. He goes up this mountain and he calls 12 specific men to follow him, to serve as his apostles. And there in the text it says to be with him. There in Mark chapter 3, verses 13, 14, and 15, he explains why he's calling these 12 specific men. That their job, their duty, their responsibility as they're being with Jesus, as they're following the leader, is to proclaim his message. What an awesome opportunity for these 12 men to spend time with Jesus. Guys, that's what discipleship is all about. You know, we talk about being a disciple of Christ, but deep down, being a disciple of Christ is all about spending time with Jesus. You know, sometimes in our professional careers, we may have something like an apprenticeship. That's what a discipleship is. When I was in college, I had the chance to do carpentry. I did trim work for 2 summers. And I know that comes as a shock to many of you because I'm more known as a techie and a yuppie, I guess, because I'm from the suburbs. But I did carpentry for about 2 years, 2 summers. And it was a fun job. But what really struck me about that job, and my boss at the time, is he didn't just say, do this job and get out of the way, like some of my previous employers had. He took me aside. And I can remember very distinctly the first couple of weeks I was there, as he took me to a house next door. A house that had just been framed, and he said, okay, here's why. He didn't just show me how to do my job. He explained the why we do things a certain way. And he wanted me to nail the baseboards in a specific place because there was a stud behind the baseboards in that specific place. Or he would want me to cut in a specific way because that helped you hide your mistakes. Cult, guys, hides a multitude of transgressions if you're doing trim work. And so one of the opportunities I had that summer was to learn how to do trim work. I got to spend time with the master carpenter and learn how to do trim work. Lessons that I still take with me even today as I do work around the house that has to do with trim work, not plumbing or electrical. I'll burn the house down. But that's what discipleship's all about. It's about going where the master goes, reading what the master reads, eating what the master eats. It's going and following the leader wherever he goes. That's what the apostles get to do here in Mark. That's what it means to be with Jesus. And here's the thing. Being with Jesus, following the leader, changed their life. Later in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 4, there's this scenario in the history of the early church where Peter and John, 2 of these 12 men we just read about, they're called on the carpet before the Jewish leaders. And the Jewish leaders look at Peter and John and go, wait a second here. You're untrained men. You didn't go to college. You didn't learn from our teachers. You didn't learn from our rabbis. How in the world do you know so much about the Bible? How in the world are you able to stand so confidently before us? And then the light bulb goes off. And in Acts 4, verse 13, it tells us that the Jewish leaders realized there in Acts 4:13 that these 2 men had been with Jesus. Being with Jesus changed the 12 apostles. It took fishermen and made them fishers of men. And do you know what? I think being with Jesus can change us today. That even today, Jesus invites us, all of us in this room, to follow him. That just like the 12 apostles here that we read about in Mark chapter 3, we have an opportunity to spend time with Jesus. Maybe not physically and walk around the Palestinian countryside, but we have time and the ability and the opportunity to spend time with Jesus, to be with Jesus by listening to his word, listening to his teaching, learning from his life. That's how we can be changed, just like Peter and John and the rest of the apostles. Guys, that's how we can become fishers of men. And so often this is where we get off track. Sometimes in our lives we think laws can change people, so our country comes up with new laws to change people, right? Or we come up with new rules to change people at work, new policies. We think that standing up for specific issues is what really changes people. But those things really deep down, they don't change us. Not deep down. Deep down, internal heart change only happens when people have been with Jesus. And so if we're here today, and we've been following Christ for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, and we're looking at our life and we're going, why am I not any more spiritually mature than I was 20 years ago? Red lights should be flashing. Neon lights should be flashing. And we need to be asking ourselves, why have I not grown? Why have I not changed? And maybe, just maybe, the reason we haven't changed, like Peter and John, is that deep down we're following rules and laws and traditions. We're building our life around specific issues. And really, we haven't been with Christ. Deep down, we aren't following the leader. Because being with Christ changes us. It takes us from the crowd like these 12 apostles and makes us the called. Being with Jesus transforms us from sinner into saint. Guys, that's what following the leader is all about. That being a disciple of Christ, following Jesus, is about taking us who are sinners, who have sinned, who continue to struggle with sin, and makes us holy to God. Following Christ, being with Jesus, is all about spiritual transformation. It's about becoming more like Christ by being with Christ. But transformation, change is hard, right? Some of you guys, Allison knows this because she knew me 15 years ago. My sister knows this because she knew me as a shock 15 years ago. But 15 years ago, I was a grumpy young guy. I was a grump. Most of you guys would have hated to be around me. Most of you guys would not have wanted to be on the football field with me because I probably would have taken your head off to get an interception. But Jesus changes us. When we look at Jesus there in the scripture, we look and go, wait a second here. Jesus loves everyone. Maybe I need to love everyone too. But transformation and change sometimes comes with opposition. And that's actually the next thing we see in Mark chapter 3. Because what Jesus is doing here in Mark chapter 3 is challenging the status quo. He's challenging everything the Jews there in the first century thought they knew about God, and that led to opposition there in Mark chapter 3 and verse 20. Let's go ahead and read Mark chapter 3 and verse 20. We're just going to read to verse 26. Jesus entered a house, and the crowd gathered again so that they were not even able to eat. And when his family heard this, they set out to restrain him because they said, he's out of his mind. Keep that in mind. The scribes who had come down from Jerusalem and said, he's possessed by Beelzebub. And he drives out demons by the ruler of the demons. And he summoned them and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom, verse 24, is divided against itself, that kingdom, Jesus says, cannot stand. That may be familiar for some of us who like history. And if Satan, or a house is divided against itself, a house cannot stand. If Satan opposes himself and is divided, verse 26, he cannot stand, but is finished. The second opportunity we have if we are with Jesus is we have the opportunity to face opposition. Now, a lot of times we don't think of opposition as an opportunity. We think of it as something like, we call it persecution, or maybe just opposition. But here in the text, Jesus goes into a house and it's so full that he's not able to eat. And his mom and his brothers and his family shows up. And for the first time in Mark's gospel, we see a glimpse into Jesus' family life. But they haven't come to support Jesus. The text tells us there in verse 21, in my translation at least, it says that we've come to restrain Jesus. They look at Jesus and they hear what he's saying, and they see what he's doing. They see how he's not living a normal Jewish life, and they go, okay, Jesus is out of his mind. Think about that for a second. Jesus' own family thought he was crazy. They thought he was confused. And on one hand, I get it. I mean, if my brother or my sister was walking around telling everybody I'm the Messiah, I think I would want to pull my brother or my sister aside and say, okay, guys, we need to have a quick talk. Are you really sure you're the Messiah? Do we need to institutionalize you? I mean, that's not something sane people normally do. But sometimes what we don't realize is we face similar opposition in our own life. Sometimes we may face that opposition in our life when we've come to Christ and somebody comes up to us and says, hey, look, I'm so glad you found religion. You needed Jesus. I remember what you were like 10 years ago. But aren't you worried you're taking this a little too far? Like, aren't you worried that going to church twice on Sunday is taking this Jesus thing a little too far? I mean, you suddenly stopped watching that TV show we used to talk about at work. You spend your Tuesday nights reading your Bible. You're no longer going out with us on Thirsty Thursdays. Suddenly, you're the happiest person in the office. You're the happiest person on the assembly line. And maybe if we're still in school, people go, wait a second, how in the world, you're now sitting next to that kid in the lunchroom? Don't you know that kid's a loser? Like, you're not supposed to sit next to that kid. Do people look at our life today, if we're a follower of Christ, and go, look, that doesn't make any sense? Are you sure you haven't lost your mind? Because that's what happened to Jesus. And if we're following the leader, it should be said of us too. But Jesus didn't just face opposition from his own family. He also faced opposition there in verse 22 from the scribes and the Jewish rulers who come down from Jerusalem. And they've heard about this teacher named Jesus. They hear that he's working miracles, and they're going down from Jerusalem to check this guy out and to see what in the world's going on in Galilee. Like, how in the world is this guy doing all this stuff? I mean, this is big news. This is headline news in Jerusalem Daily News. But here in Mark chapter 3, they don't think Jesus is crazy. They ridicule him. They mock him. And there in the text they say, he's possessed by Beelzebub. That's a nice way of saying he's possessed by Satan. Like, that's, just to put it mildly, not a nice thing to say about anyone. And they are really going at Jesus. They're really talking some trash about Jesus. And look how Jesus responds there in verse 23. He looks at the Jewish leaders there in verse 23 and says, why in the world would Satan drive out Satan? Like, why in the world would he do that? That doesn't make any sense. Satan doesn't work against himself. He goes on and gives a couple of illustrations there in verse 24. A kingdom that is divided against itself, that kingdom's not going to stand. A house that's divided against itself ain't going to stand. 150 or so years ago, Abraham Lincoln used these words to talk about the state of our nation as we were embroiled in that great civil war. How can we stand if we are divided? And so Jesus' point here in the text is that Jesus doesn't work for Satan. It's the opposite way. He goes on to explain that I came to destroy Satan. You know, the opposition that Jesus faced here from his family and also the Jewish leaders gave Jesus the chance, it gave Jesus the opportunity to preach the gospel. It gave Jesus the opportunity there in verse 27 through 30 to explain how he came not to work for Satan, not to advance Satan's cause, but it's the opposite way. Jesus came to bind up the strong man. Jesus came, it says there in the text, to bind up Satan so Satan could be defeated. And so all of these miracles, all of the demons that Jesus is casting out is not because Jesus is working for Satan. It's to prove that Satan has lost his power. It gives Jesus, this opposition gives Jesus this opportunity to proclaim his victory and the coming victory over Satan. And that's good news for all of us. Because Jesus' victory over Satan gives us hope. But it's also a reminder that if Jesus, our leader, our master, faced opposition, guys, we will too. We are going to be mocked by our friends and our family. They're going to look at our life and see how we're living. And they're going to go, you've taken things too far. You've lost your ever-loving mind. They're going to look at our lives and go, look here, you're crazy. We're going to be ridiculed by people at work. We're going to be ridiculed by our enemies. We're going to be ridiculed by the bullies at school. But in these moments of opposition, the moments of opposition that Jesus faces and that we may face in our own life, those moments prove that if we are following the leader, they give us the opportunity for us to preach the gospel and to point people to the forgiveness that God provides. And that's what Jesus does there in verse 28 and 29. He points people to forgiveness. And that's what following the leader is all about. It's about forgiveness. It's about transformation. But we also see here in Mark chapter 3 a third opportunity. Mark chapter 3 there in verse 31, it reads, his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting there, verse 32, around him and told him, look, your mother, your brothers, and your sisters are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my brothers? Who are my mothers and my brothers? Verse 33. Looking at those sitting in a circle around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God, verse 35, is my brother and sister and mother. The third opportunity that we have if we are with following Christ is the opportunity to obey. Once again, here in Jesus' life and in his ministry, he's surrounded. And once again, here in the text, his mother and his brothers come. And they're on the outside, and people are sending word to Jesus saying, hey, your mom and your brothers are here. I don't know what's going through their mind. Maybe they thought Jesus was going to roll out the red carpet and give his family the VIP treatment. Maybe he'd honor his family in some special way. But that's not what Jesus does there in the text. In verse 33, he looks around when he finds this out and says in verse 33, who are my mother and my brothers? Jesus asked a question. But he also answers that question there in verse 35. Here's what my mother and my brothers do. Here's who my mother and my brother really are. Those who, verse 35, do the will of God. That's who my mother and my brother and my sisters are. My family, my real family, are people who do the will of God. Let that sink in for a second. That our real family, our true family, are those who obey God. That family is more important to us and to Jesus than his own mother. I know Mother Day is coming up around the corner. I think it's in 2 weeks. Don't count on that. Check your own calendars. But I want to tell you this. Verse 35 is not something you write on a Mother's Day card. Okay, don't do that, guys. Don't write that on a Mother's Day card. Please don't. But these words that Jesus says there in verse 33 and 34 and 35 would have shocked the crowds because family was super important to them. family in that day and that age was more important to them than religion. To leave your family religion, to leave your family was anathema. It was a cursed thing to do. And so what Jesus says there in the text must have made Mary feel like she had been stabbed in the heart. After all, she gave birth to Jesus. She nursed Jesus. She changed Jesus' diapers. She raised Jesus. She fed Jesus. So what in the world is going on here in Mark chapter 3? With Mother's Day 2 weeks away, does Jesus even love his mom? Of course he loved his mom. As he hung there on the cross, he made provision for one person and one person alone. He made provision for his mother. He loved his mom. But I think the real point here, the point that Jesus is trying to emphasize to us today, is that Jesus has a bigger and a better family than his biological family. That what really matters to Jesus isn't our hometown. It isn't our last name. It isn't our job. It isn't where we went to school. It's doing the will of God. That's what really matters to Jesus. You know, as parents, we want our kids to grow up and love God and to love their families. We want them to grow up to get good jobs so they can come and in our old age take care of us, right? We want somebody's got to take care of us. But do we teach our kids to love God more than they love their families? Do we teach our children that obeying God is the most important thing they can do in their life? You know, so often we talk about being raised in a Christian family. That's where our focus is. My parents are Christians, and my grandparents are Christians, and my great-grandparents are Christians. And if you can go all the way back to like the 1850s, you can even maybe be able to say, my great-great-great-grandparents are Christians. You may be able to say that. And that's great. That's cool. That's a blessing. But are we, as individuals today, doing the will of God? Because when the rubber meets the road and we stand before God in judgment, I can't answer God and say, God, my grandma did your will. And he's going to go, okay, that's great. Did you? Did you do my will? Because what Jesus is teaching us here in Mark chapter 3 and verse 35 is that obeying God's will, obeying God, is how we become part of God's family. The faith of our physical family doesn't matter. Our nationality doesn't matter. Doing the will of God is what really matters. And nothing, not even our own families, is more important than God. And those are hard words for us to hear. And I think that's why it's so easy for us to get off track even today. Because as parents, sometimes we want our kids to get good grades. We want them to be the valedictorian or the salutatorian or the top 10% of their class so they can go to that school, so they can get that job. So in our old age, they can take care of us and provide comfort and security to our grandkids. But that stuff really doesn't matter. Deep down, it doesn't matter if we're valedictorian or salutatorian. It doesn't matter if we become a doctor, a lawyer, or an Indian chief. What Jesus is telling us here in the text is what really matters before God is doing his will. Because on Judgment Day, we're not going to open up our transcripts from high school or college and show God, look here, I was a 4.0 at this school. Let me in. That's not going to help you. On Judgment Day, we're not going to be able to open up our W-2s from our career and say, look, God, look what I made during my career as a doctor or a lawyer. Those things aren't really going to matter. It's not going to matter what job we had on that day. It's going to matter that we do the will of God. But the opportunity to do God's will, the opportunity to obey God comes with tremendous benefits. It comes with the benefit of being a part of a large family, God's family. And that's a family that includes people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It's a family that includes David and Daniel. It includes Esther and Rahab and Ruth and, yes, I think even Mary. That's what it means to be a part of God's family. That our brother and our mother and our sisters aren't just those who share blood and DNA with us. They're the people who share that focus and desire to obey God. That is a family that is built on faith, a family that is committed to following our leader, our Christ, our Savior, wherever He may go. And that's a family that I believe will be together for all eternity. This means that the bond that we share with our brothers and sisters in Christ, the bond that we share with that family of faith needs to be stronger, must be stronger, is stronger than that bond we have with our own physical family. And I think some of us may have realized this in our own travels on vacation. Maybe we've gone to Seattle and we've walked into a church building on Sunday morning, or we've been in North Dakota for vacation, or we've gone to New York City or Orlando, and we're far away from deep East Texas. And we walk into a church building and someone reaches out their hand and says, "My name is," and we meet them, and instantly there's a bond. And a conversation occurs, and lo and behold, y'all have some connection, some bond. But I think one of the reasons there's that instant bond when we go visit other churches on vacation is that we share that common commitment, that common goal, that common purpose, that common mission of obeying God. And because we share that common purpose and because we share that common mission, we serve one another, we love one another, we encourage one another because we're all a part of the same family. After all, isn't that what families do? Don't our own physical families, don't we understand on some level that when one of us is down, we encourage them? When our brother or our sister is dumped, we encourage them. When a brother or a sister loses a family member, we encourage them, we love them, we take care of them. Isn't that what we do in our physical families? But even more so, isn't that what we need to be doing in our spiritual families? That's what it means to be a part of God's family. Not just doing God's will, but part of doing God's will is actually encouraging and serving and loving one another. And we do all of this because we're committed to following our leader. Because that's what our leader did. He encouraged the weak. He loved the loveless. He served all people. And if we're committed to following the leader, we'll take that and we'll do that wherever it may take us. But here's the thing. Anyone can follow the leader. Anyone here this morning can follow the leader. Anyone out there, anyone in our community, anyone around the world can follow the leader. But not without giving up everything. And this means, I think, that doing God's will becomes our purpose and our mission in life. That we give our heart and our soul and our might to doing God's will, to being transformed, to being more like Christ. And when we make that decision to join God's family, we make a decision to join a family that is greater and larger than anything we will ever experience here on earth. When we make a decision to join God's family, we commit ourselves to obeying our leader wherever it may take us. It means we follow in the footprints of Jesus wherever they go. If you're here this morning and you're ready to follow in the footprints of Jesus, let us know. If you're ready to do the will of God, let us know. You can make that commitment. You can make that decision this morning by confessing Jesus as Lord, committing to doing His will, and obeying that command that He has given us to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins. If that's something you'd like to do, don't leave here today without telling someone. Please let us know if we can help in any way. While together we stand and sing.